You woke to the weight of silence pressing down on your thin wooden room, the sticky scent of stale sweat clinging to the warm air. The rough fibers of your faded kimono stuck uncomfortably to your skin, a grim reminder of sleepless nights marked by restless worry. Outside, endless rows of silken cocoons hung like quiet ghosts, their invisible occupants crawling with menace that had seeped into every corner of your village. Today, like every day since the plague began, you dragged yourself toward the cold stone storage, feet tired and hesitant. The coarse scrape of countless silk cases against wood filled your ears in a slow, dragging rhythm, as you carefully separated the infested ones, preventing the relentless spread of ruin. The pale morning light filtered through sliding paper screens, casting dim shadows that barely touched the grayish walls. Outside, the frozen breath of winter lingered in the air, and you could hear the brittle snap of frost under each careful step you took. The smoke of yesterday's dying fire still lingered with a smoky tang, blending with the mustiness of decaying leaves pressed into the earth. Your fingers curled around the stiff hem of your only coat, feeling the worn wool's uneven texture as your breath came slower, measured, and cautious. The village lay cloaked under a soft fog, the wooden houses silent but for the occasional rustle of a distant leaf falling. If today's frustrations had a modern counterpart, it might be the sharp sting of a phone battery flashing its final red warning. Except now, your power was the fragile thread of life itself, burning down quietly amid these ancient shadows. You made your way to the communal fire pit, where hesitant warmth flickered in the still morning air. Faces, pale and drawn, came alive briefly as the shared heat touched cold skin. For a moment, the oppressive weight seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile pulse of human connection. The quiet exchange offered a breath of hope, as tender and fleeting as the glow of embers fading into ash. Returning to the storage, the air grew heavy with the tangled odor of wilted leaves and sharp dust. Every rustle and crack of shells beneath your fingers demanded the utmost attention. The smallest slip could summon disaster. You double-checked each bundle, feeling the fine silk thread whisper beneath your touch, the texture simultaneously delicate and binding you closer to this relentless task. The weight of responsibility rested on your shoulders, the sound of soft, distant footsteps echoing faintly in the cold hall. Suddenly, all noise ceased. The familiar squeals of village dogs vanished into an eerie hush. You paused, breath catching, as eyes met across the shadowed space. A silent understanding passed between you. The plague was changing. Darkness gathered beyond the fragile walls, gravity settling heavier than before. You sensed the creeping dread tightening its grip, as invisible threads wove danger closer, and the village held its breath, awaiting what was to come. Hey, before Morpheus takes you fully, check quickly if you're still subscribed. For some, the button vanished, and I don't want you to miss the next Sleepy Tales. Take a moment to leave a soft, pillow-like like. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it? Your interaction keeps this quiet corner alive. Thanks for being part of it. You moved slowly back toward the village's center, the faint echo of ghostly silence lingering heavier than the cold itself. The morning light, pale and reluctant, stretched thin fingers through the drifting fog, barely touching the rough-hewn paths beneath your feet. The wooden boards creaked faintly under each step, as if whispering warnings you were not quite ready to hear. You pulled your coat tighter, its worn fibers rough against your skin. A subtle boundary against the chill that sunk deep into the marrow. Your breath formed fleeting clouds that mingled with the frost-laden air, dissolving before long. Each inhale carried the metallic hint of decay, woven seamlessly with the distant scent of burnt wood from last night's embers. Leaves, brittle and pressed underfoot, crunched softly, an oddly sharp contrast to the overwhelming quiet. Your ears strained for the familiar signs of life. The barely perceptible rustle of wings, town dogs' distant howls, the murmur of souls still clinging to their fragile existence. But today, those small assurances seemed swallowed by the pressing silence. You found your way to the communal fire pit again. The flickering warmth greeted you hesitantly, faces rising slowly from shadowed forms to meet the fragile heat. Their eyes, glazed but alert, reflected the pale flames like dying stars caught in frozen wells. You felt their shared exhaustion mingle with your own, a thread that, though thin, tethered you all within this devastated village. Fingers curled around a dry twig, coaxing a soft crackle from the reluctant fire. The orange glow was a small rebellion against the pervasive cold that no ember could truly banish. As you exhaled, your chest tightened with a quiet desperation, a tether fraying between hope and despair. From beyond the cluster of houses, a slow, deliberate sound crept through the frozen air. You paused, breath held, ears reaching into the haze. It wasn't the crunch of footsteps or the scrape of stone. It was a soft, wet scraping noise, unnerving and cadenced. The hush deepened, wrapping around you like a shroud. You looked toward the thick brambles at the village's edge, where shadows pooled darker than the rest. The air trembled faintly, as though the earth itself was breathing. Slow, measured, unavoidable. Your fingers instinctively tightened around the fabric of your coat. The silk cocoons hung still in the branches. But in that moment, something felt irrevocably altered, as if the invisible menace within them was no longer just awaiting passage, but stirring with intention. You stepped toward the boundary where the familiar paths ended and the unknown began. Every sound magnified in the claustrophobic quiet. The brittle frost beneath your boots gave way to dirt, soft and damp. The earth, cold, yet strangely alive with muted thuds. Perhaps nothing but the shifting roots and rocks, but your mind traced each pattern, searching for meaning. You traced your way along the outer edge of the village, where the gnarled trees hunched over the worn fences like twisted sentinels. The scent around you turned sharper, like rust on metal mixed with something thick, almost viscous. A dark moisture clung to the bark, slick and unforgiving to your tentative touch. You pulled back, shivering despite the coat, the chill now more than physical. Your skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes watching, weaving a silent threat into the heavy air. Turning back, your steps faltered at the sight of a small patch of ground near the path, disrupted as if something heavy had pressed into the earth moments before. The soil was loose, crumbled, oddly soft beneath your feet, imprinted with marks too shallow to identify. You crouched, fingers tracing the edges delicately. The frost had begun to melt there, the cold receding just enough to reveal hidden secrets beneath. A faint metallic tang lingered faintly on the air. You stood slowly, the lingering unease curling into a tightened knot low in your stomach. Moving toward the village once more, the brittle crunch of stick and leaf underfoot fell into a slow rhythm with your heartbeat, steady but wary. The cloying silence pressed close again, broken only by the distant crackle of firewood from a lone chimney, a fragile sign of life sustained with effort and care. You allowed yourself a brief glance upward, where pale skies blended indistinctly with swirling mist. A single weak ray of sunlight pierced the gray. It was fragile, like a sigh from a world too tired to breathe fully. You reached the threshold of your room. The rough paper screens quivered faintly in a breeze that seemed to hum with quiet menace. Just beyond them, the village held its breath, every shuttered door and shuttered window a guard against the encroaching dark. You slid open the screen and looked out into the thin, gray light. The silhouettes of cocoons charted a silent map of fear, clustered thick as winter's frost, their contents unseen but palpably close. Inside, the familiar weightless stillness engulfed you, but beneath it, a new tension settled, different from the creeping dread of the days before. It was heavier, colder, pressing in with slow inevitability, as if the village's fragile hold on normalcy was poised on a knife's edge. You hesitated, fingers grazing the worn tatami beneath your feet, eyes tracing the faint shadows cast by the morning's soft light. A quiet tapping sounded suddenly at the door's edge, a slow, deliberate knock, measured against the stillness. The sound sliced through the heavy air, sharp and unexpected. Your breath caught in your throat, every muscle tensed, every noise magnified. You knew that no one would visit without reason in this place caught between life and ruin. The knocking came again, steady, patient, inviting or warning, you could not yet tell. Outside, the fog deepened, swallowing the village whole, as if the earth itself was folding in on its fragile secrets. And you, caught between the silence and the shadow, waited, suspended on the cusp of what was to come. You tightened your grip on the door's worn wooden frame as the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Each knock a measured beat against the fragile quiet that cloaked your existence. The heavy stillness of your room seemed to lean inward, compressing the air. You gazed out once more through the thin paper screens. The gray dawn pressed against the shapes of clustered cocoons, their silence thick enough to swallow whole the faintest breath. Outside, the village held its fragile edge between light and shadow, a balance poised as precariously as your own steadying pulse. Your breath was shallow, each exhale a quiet fog that vanished quickly, leaving behind the sharp, cold sting of the morning air, weaving through the cracks in the wooden frame. You allowed the seconds to stretch, counting invisibly between beats, every nerve alert to what this knock might portend. The weight of the plague that had settled on your shoulders felt heavier now, the memory of each soft scraping sound echoing back, vivid and intrusive. The silence beyond the door rippled like a taut string, waiting for release. The knocking came once more, steady and patient, like the soft tap of a cautious visitor seeking entrance into a forgotten home. You hesitated, fingers brushing the coarse timber beside the doorframe, textured, rough as cracked earth. The warmth of your coat seemed suddenly insufficient, and a subtle shiver traced thin lines down your spine, despite the layers wrapped tight around your worn body. Outside, the wind whispered low through the frost-bitten eaves, threading a chill inside the quiet that settled like dust on your skin. Slowly, you stepped back from the door, glancing toward the darkened shadows pooling beneath the eaves. The village, swathed in fog, seemed suspended beyond time's grasp, a whisper in the breath of winter. For a moment, the faint crackle of the communal fire drifted through the air, a fragile ember of life flickering in the distance, its glow hesitant but persistent. The faces you had seen there this morning, thin, drawn, eyes clouded with exhaustion and fear, pressed gently against your memory like faded ink on fragile parchment. You clutched that image and held it close, a quiet warmth against the encroaching cold. The restless silence around you pulsed with the subtle noises of a world tilting toward change. The soft scrape that had disturbed the morning, the weight that had pressed the earth near the village's edge, All screamed in muted urgency beneath the veneer of stillness. You moved across the room, your feet bare on the worn tatami, feeling the faint prickling roughness beneath them. Your hands slid over the cracked walls, tracing the grain of wood worn smooth by countless years and countless sorrows. The scent of dry leaves and ancient smoke thickened the heavy air, blending with the faint bite of dusk still clinging in the early light. You crossed to the small window, where the thin paper breathed softly against the slight breeze. Peering out, the fading fog clung to twisted branches, heavy with the silent cocoons. They swayed gently, as if stirred by an unseen breath, their white shells gleaming faintly in the weak light. A shudder passed through you, as eyes sought the path once more, beyond the village's guarded border. The footprints still marked the damp earth near where you had knelt hours before. Shallow impressions, hardly settling into the softened soil, but present enough to unsettle. The metallic tang you had smelled hovered faint and persistent, wrapping around the edges of your senses like a whispered warning. You pulled your coat tighter once again, the rough texture pressing in familiar ways, a small morsel of protection against the gathering menace. Back inside, you sank slowly to the floor, legs folded beneath your body, the tatami cool beneath your skin. Tiny shivers collided with a breath of resignation that settled low in your chest, tight and solemn. The fire's faint glow from the distant pit seemed now a world away, a flickering memory of fragile hope. Around you, the silence thickened again, wrapping tight like a shroud. But beneath it, beneath the weighted quiet, something else lingered, something watching patiently beyond the paper walls. Then, almost impossibly faint, a sound broke through. A single, slow breath drawn beyond your door. It was subtle, nearly swallowed by the vast emptiness. Yet you heard it clear and resonant, a fragile gate swinging open between two worlds. Your heart caught on the edge of that sound, a soft, ragged inhale that was neither entirely human nor animal. Your breath quickened, but your body remained still, frozen in a moment suspended between dread and curiosity. The knocking returned one last time, a hesitant pulse that seemed both invitation and warning. Fingers trembling slightly, you moved forward, hand reaching out with deliberate slowness. Every scraped minute detail, the cracked wood, cold beneath your touch, the whisper of air slipping through the crack, etched itself deep into your memory as you prepared to face what waited on the other side. Outside, the fog thickened into a veil that swallowed the village whole, muffling the faintest of sounds and erasing the landscape you thought you knew. And just as your fingers brushed the door's surface to pry it open, a faint, unfamiliar scent drifted in, a mixture of wet earth and something acrid, like iron seeping from unseen wounds. The odor clawed at your senses, a raw and wild presence that pulsed just beyond the threshold. You hesitated, breath caught in a silent gasp, sensing the moment's frailty. Then, as the door began to shift beneath your touch, the sound of hundreds of unseen wings stirred suddenly in the branches above. A slow, swelling crescendo that surrounded the village like a soundless storm preparing to break. The air tightened, pressed close against your skin, filled with the slow, certain promise of what was about to come. And in that instant, the door swung almost imperceptibly ajar, inviting you forward into the waiting shadow where the plague's true face was finally stirring awake. You pushed the door slowly, feeling the delivery of cold air spill into your room like water surging through a narrow channel. The threshold seemed to stretch longer than it should, the wood groaning softly beneath your hesitant hand. Outside, the fog clung thickly, a gray ocean swallowing the village piece by piece. Your eyes barely adjusted to the muted shapes that hovered just beyond the veil, a fractured landscape of silent houses and frozen paths. A brittle gust fluttered the tattered edges of your coat, brushing thin against your skin, colder than before, as if the morning itself held its breath. You stepped over the threshold, each footfall sinking slightly into the damp earth, the cold creeping past your protective layers and seeping slowly into your bones. The faint scent of wet soil mixed with the rusty tang you had noticed earlier, threading through the air like an unseen current, pulling you toward the village border. Your senses sharpened against the stillness, each sound magnified in the quiet. The scraping noise returned, subtle but unmistakable, like fingered claws tracing wood or stone. It came from the direction of the brambles, where the cocoons clung thickest, shadows buried beneath shrouds of silver silk. You moved deliberately, slow and steady, the coarse ground crunching beneath your every step, muffled by layers of frost and fallen leaves. With every breath, the sharp cold settled deeper, your lungs tightening against the weight of anticipation. The still air pressed around you so tightly it was nearly audible, a pulsing, sighing blanket that seemed to swallow all movement. You reached the edge of the village fence, gnarled and weathered, where twisted boughs arched like sorrowful guardians. The white cocoons hung in tight clusters, their thin silk glistening faintly with dampness. You leaned closer, the fragile shells trembling ever so slightly, as if stirred by a breath no one could feel. Beneath the layers, a restless shifting stirred uneasily. Your fingertips brushed the rough bark of a tree, slick with cold moisture, the texture uneven and slick like wet stone. The metallic scent intensified, curling in cold spirals around your nose and throat. You swallowed slowly, the taste bitter and sharp. A faint rustling whispered through the branches, a cautious murmur that set your pulse thudding in slow, deliberate beats. You held still, heart steady, as the silence thickened once more. A shadow shifted, just beyond the rim of fog, blending with the dark tangle of branches. You flexed your muscles, the familiar chill of fear curling low and tight. But you did not turn away. Instead, you drew a slow and measured breath, the rough air filling your lungs with quiet resolve. You knelt beside a trampled patch of earth, marks still visible in the soft mud, shallow but telling. Your fingers traced the delicate imprints, each one a whispered secret of movement, the story of something or someone recently passed. The coldness beneath your hands seemed to pull at your skin, the frost already melting into a delicate, slick sheen. A hint of iron lingered faintly at the edges of your imagination. A ghostly scent borne on the shifting wind. The forest beyond breathed against the village's edge, a living thing, pulsing slowly, surely. You felt the weight of unseen eyes digging into your back, their attention threaded quietly through the fog. You rose slowly, the muscles in your legs protesting the long hold, and stepped back toward the warmth that still flickered faintly at the village's heart. The fragile fire embers, painted orange against the gray morning, beckoned you like the last hope of light in a vast tomb. Faces emerged from the mist, pale and hollow, their eyes flickering with fragile flickers of recognition and exhaustion. You met their gaze briefly, a shared understanding passing unspoken. Hope was scant and fragile, yet fiercely clung to amid the gathering dark. The wind shifted, cold and cutting, and you pulled your coat tighter around your frame once more. The wooden boards beneath your feet creaked softly with age, each sound stretched and drawn in this hollow morning. Silence, thick and suffocating, cloaked the village anew. A sudden sharp crack banked through the air, the brittle snap of a dead branch falling somewhere hidden beyond sight. You held your breath, senses prickling with quiet dread. From the cluster of houses nearby, you heard faint murmurs, a voice, perhaps frail and distant, quickly swallowed by the vast silence. You strained for more, but the cold hushed the sound before it could settle, leaving you alone once again with the heavy air. Your skin prickled beneath your clothes as the metallic tang seeped deeper into your awareness, the scent growing stronger, more insistent. A slow, deliberate movement in the fog caught your eye. A silhouette, bending, shifting near the edge of the forest. It remained still for a moment, then vanished, swallowed whole by the mist as if it had never been. Your heart tightened, the calm thread of breath faltering just so. You stepped back toward the furthest house, where the fire's glow wrapped a small circle of warmth around those faded faces. The momentary safety was intoxicating, but fleeting. Re-entering the house, the heavy sliding door whispered closed behind you, sealing in the cold silence. The familiar weight of tatami underfoot seemed almost too soft, too fragile, as if it might crumble under the strain of the day's dread. You sank slowly to the floor, folding your legs beneath you, the thin air filling the room with an aching quiet. Outside, the cocoons swayed faintly, each a vessel of slow, inevitable motion. The silence cracked again, the softest scraping. Barely a scrape, barely so much as that. Then a sudden rush, bursting wings, hundreds, perhaps thousands, all stirring at once above the village, a shiver through the frozen branches that echoed deep inside your chest. And in the breathless moment before the dark descended fully, a single wordless sigh slipped beneath the door, colder and closer than ever before. You stood frozen, the door barely open, allowing a sliver of the heavy fog to seep into your room like a slow-moving shadow. The air carried the pungent mix of damp earth and iron, raw, biting, unsettling, and it curled around you, pressing deep against your lungs as if searching for breath. Your fingers, tense and trembling just moments before, tightened their grip on the doorframe, reluctant to step fully into the cold unknown, yet pulled by a force beyond your control. The silence outside was thick as wool, muffling every fragile sound into a distant memory. Stepping forward, you wove through the dim morning, your feet sinking into the softened earth beneath the shallow frost. Each movement was deliberate, cautious. The chill nipped at your exposed skin, where the worn threads of your coat betrayed weakness. Around you, the village lay draped in a veil of gray, houses blurred into faded silhouettes, and the brittle branches dangling white cocoons stoically held their secret menace. A subtle trembling ran through them, as if the silk-veiled prisoners stirred, responsive to the silent call that hovered unseen. You inhaled sharply, the scent of oxidized metal thickening as you neared the boundary where brambles twisted like ancient fingers guarding a forbidden passage. Your pulse slowed, syncing with the tentative rhythm of your breath, steady and slow. The soft, wet, scraping sound returned, more precise now, the noise of something brushing against bark and stone, deliberate, careful. Your skin prickled with a cold awareness that the air itself had grown denser, layered with watchful eyes that hid just beyond your vision. With measured steps, you skirted the edge of the village, where burnt leaves littered the path and patches of mud showed recent disturbance. You knelt slowly by the ground, fingertips grazing the soft, dark soil that gave way beneath your touch. The footprints, shallow and irregular, spelled chaos in their silence, footfalls of something neither fully living nor dead, creeping through fragile thresholds. A faint metallic sting lingered in the air, the bitter taste of unease you had learned not to ignore. You straightened slowly, the weight of the cold pressing against your back. The nearby trees whispered, secrets in a language of creaking wood and shifting branches. Your coat, rough against your skin, seemed to bristle with unseen frost. A shudder traced your spine as though the forest itself exhaled a long, mournful breath. the breath of a world poised on the edge. You stepped back toward the warmth, flickering faintly from the village's hearths, though even this fragile light trembled under the oppressive shroud. Faces emerged from the heavy mist as you returned, hollowed, drawn, haunted, but their eyes held a flicker of something enduring, a weak pulse against the overwhelming gray. You exchanged no words. The silence was a shared language, each breath a quiet plea for survival. You knelt by the fire pit, the dry twigs cracking softly beneath your careful coaxing. The fire's glow was timid, struggling to fend off the shivers of the cold that wove through the bones of the village. But you welcomed its gentle heat, pressing your hands close, palms rough and tired. Outside, the fog deepened once more, pooling into thick folds that rose and fell like slow waves above the sleeping rooftops. Your ears caught the faintest rustle again, the subtle whisper of wings fluttering in agonizing hesitation. The cocoons swayed lightly, their surfaces trembling, as if responding to a silent signal. You swallowed the tight knot growing in your throat, the bitter metallic scent hanging like a thick fog inside your chest. The air grew heavier, each inhalation a labor, each movement a reminder of the thin boundary between stillness and chaos. Rising, you walked toward your room, the worn wooden boards creaking softly beneath your steps. The paper screens fluttered in the breath of a cold draft slipping in. From outside, the soft rustle aggravated your senses, sharpening the tension coiling within. You paused at the threshold, your hand resting on familiar, rough wood, the smell of dry earth and smoke settling around you like a faded memory. The lingering power of the moment sucked the warmth from your bones, leaving you suspended in a fragile space between what was and what might come. Then, without warning, a soft thud echoed faintly behind you, barely more than a sound, but enough to still your breath. The hairs along your neck stood alert. You turned slowly, eyes searching the gray haze beyond your window. For a moment, nothing stirred but the silent dance of the trembling cocoons. Then, from the corner of your vision, you caught the barest hint of movement, a slender shadow slipping between the gnarled tree trunks, disappearing before you could fix its shape. Your heart paused, beating unevenly, each pulse a drum in the vast stillness. The metallic scent thickened abruptly, coiling like tendrils around your senses, sharpening the edges of your fear into an icy blade. Every instinct screamed stillness, caution, invisibility. And yet, beneath this rising storm, a pulse beckoned, an invitation woven through the cold dark, a promise of revelation and peril intertwined. Pulling your coat tighter, you stepped back from the door and sat on the tatami, the thin mat, cool and unyielding, beneath your legs folded quietly. You pressed your palms to your knees, grounding yourself in the fragile calm that remained while the world balanced untold moments away from shattering. The wind outside whispered louder, carrying a slow crescendo of sound that shivered through the branches, the beating of 1,000 wings rising. In silent fury, swelling like a breath held too long, the village seemed to tremble beneath the weight of impending shadow. And you felt, deep and unrelenting, the stirrings of the plague's true face awakening at last. And then, just as the dark threatened to consume all, you heard it, an unspoken sigh slipping beneath the cracks of the door, chilling and close, as if something unseen had crossed the boundary. Your breath caught once more, frozen in that fragile, endless moment, and everything waited, teetering on the precipice of what would come next. You hesitated just beyond the threshold, the narrow line between the safety your room offered and the cold, inscrutable world outside. The fog poured in like a slow tide, curling across your skin with a damp chill that seeped past worn seams, seeking bone. Your fingers lingered on the rough wood, tracing its grain as shadows shifted in the gray light, and the soft rustle of silk stirred thick in the branches nearby. Beneath that fragile silk, invisible movements whispered secrets you dared not name aloud. Each breath you drew was sharp and shallow, laced with the metallic tang that had haunted the edges of your senses since morning. The earth beneath your feet was soaked, cold frost melting into mud that cracked softly under each careful step. The village exhaled around you, a quiet pulse beneath the weight of silence, fragile as ember glow, fading into ash at the heart of a long winter night. The scent of scorched leaves and damp wood clung stubbornly to the air, tangled with the bitter edge of iron that pressed close like memory. A faint scraping returned, a cautious sound like a slow fingernail sliding over weather-beaten bark. Your head tilted, straining to catch each nuance as it twined through the brittle air. It came from the dark tangle of branches where the thickest cocoons hung, swaying gently but with purpose. The fragile shells quivered, almost imperceptibly. A restless stir betrayed something alive but silent, waiting beneath the thin veil of silk that seemed less a prison and more a warning. You shuffled forward, breath fogging the space before you, hands sliding to steady yourself against the gnarled fence post. Its rough surface bit into your palm, gritty with flakes of moss and cold dew. The wet earth pressed close, soft and silent, a stark contrast to the brittle frost that remained on broken leaves scattered beneath the skeletal trees. You felt the world hold its breath here, joined to you in a moment, suspended between the all-consuming silence and the faintest sound of inevitable change. The scraping crept closer, just beyond sight, but near enough to raise gooseflesh in slow waves up your arms. You swallowed the thick knot forming low in your throat, your senses sharpening to a keen edge. The air was heavy, dense with an unseen presence, pressing against your skin like a weight you could neither resist nor see. The forest exhaled around you, a slow pulse of violence, mournful breath that rustled the leaves and stirred the ghostly cocoons with eerie grace. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed nearby, muffled and urgent. Your heart jerked, uneven and loud against the stillness. Shadows shifted beyond the veil, and the faintest glimmer of movement, a slight sway of branches, the brushing of silk, reached your eyes. You dared not blink, as if the fragile thread holding you in this waking nightmare. The scent thickened once more, crawling with sour iron and damp earth, weaving itself through each inhalation. Your feet found the beaten path again, leaving shallow impressions in the softened ground as you moved back toward the village's faint glow. The fire pit lay ahead, its fragile orange tendrils barely licking the frozen air. Faces rose slowly from the haze, pale, drawn, yet alive in the small circle of warmth. Their eyes met yours briefly in shared vigilance, worn lines betraying exhaustion and quiet fear. Your chest tightened with the gravity of unspoken understanding, a flicker against the deepening shadow clutching at your world. A brittle wind whispered through the skeletal branches, carrying with it the faint melody of hundreds of wings beating in hesitant unison. The swarm above seemed to pulse. With a growing urgency, the sound a muted roar that stirred the frozen village. You pressed your hands close to the fire, rough palms absorbing tentative heat. But even the glow barely dented the chill threading through your bones. The moment stretched thin, time folding back on itself as breath slowed and eyes narrowed against the creeping dark. You traced the worn edges of your coat, its rough fibers a grounding tether, while the night's cold seeped deeper into the marrow. The stillness that had held the village captive fractured subtly, fractured like the slow cracking of ice on a frozen pond. Each small fracture a whisper of change, of threat awakening. In the distance, beyond the circle of firelight, you caught sight of a figure, or was it the shifting fog playing tricks? Moving deliberately near the border where shadow folded into shadow. It lingered just at the edge of your vision, a shape too vague, too swift to fully discern. Your throat tightened, your pulse sharpening as the cold unease deepened with unrelenting insistence. Stepping back from the fire, you moved silently toward your room. The rough boards creaked underfoot, each sound a note in the symphony of cautious survival. The paper screens fluttered gently in the draft, a pale dance of fragile light preparing to close. As you reached the doorframe, a sudden, delicate shift brushed past, a sigh, breath-like and wordless, slipping beneath the crack like smoke seeping through a narrow fissure. Frozen, You let silence fill the space, heart beating slow but loud in your chest, every nerve attuned to the impossibility before you. The village held its breath again. Outside, the cocoons quivered in eerie rhythm, a quiet drum heralding the slow, inevitable awakening of the dark that slept inside them. And as your hand hovered on the door's edge, the faintest whisper of movement stirred from within the shadows, a single unseen presence stepping forward beyond the veil, waiting. You stepped over the threshold, the dim morning light swallowing you into the quiet world beyond the door. The village lay wrapped in its cold shroud, gray mist curling around silent houses like a slow breath held too long. Your feet sank slightly in the damp earth, cold seeping past your worn coat, drawing a thin line of chill down your spine. The air was heavy, thick, with the metallic scent that clung stubbornly to your senses, mingling with the fading sharpness of burnt wood and the faint, decayed tang of forgotten leaves. The silk cocoons hanging from twisted branches swayed gently, almost hypnotically, their pale shells trembling against the muted world. You reached a hand toward one, the delicate threads rough against your fingertips, fragile yet unyielding, like the invisible barrier between life and the encroaching shadow. Beneath that silken veil, something moved with deliberate slowness, a subtle shifting that stirred unease deep within you. The sound drifted softly, a low scraping, like talons drawing slowly over bark, unsettling but controlled. You pressed onward, each step careful, measured. The brittle frost crunching faintly beneath boot and twig in a mournful rhythm that matched your steady breath. Your eyes probed the edges of the village, where gnarled branches arched menacingly, and the ground turned soft and damp. The footprints, pressed shallow against the melting frost, caught your attention. Irregular, scattered marks that whispered of movement, of presence. Your fingertips brushed the cold soil, catching the faintest hint of iron underneath the earth, a lingering stain that tasted like an old wound reopening. In the heavy silence, a faint murmur shifted through the mist, the flutter of wings, hesitant yet growing. Hundreds of tiny heartbeats caught in the air. The cocoons quivered again, a delicate dance of white silk catching the pale light. You shivered, despite the layers wrapped tight around you, a cold rippling in the marrow. There was something waiting just beyond the visible, something that had crossed the fragile line from sleeper to watcher. Behind the curtain of fog, a shifting silhouette caught your eye, a low crouch near the edge where branches nodded thickly, a motion like whispered breath in the gray quiet. Your breath hitched, heart tapping a slow beat of alertness against the cold. You held your ground, muscles coiled in silent readiness, then exhaled slowly, the air sharp and biting as it left your lungs. Turning back, The pale glow of the village fire pit beckoned, a flicker of warmth against the gathering chill. Faces emerged from shadows there, drawn and hollow, their eyes flickering with exhaustion, but alive with shared resolve. You allowed yourself a brief refuge in their presence, feeling the fragile thread of connection in the faint pulse of human breathing and whispered prayers. The quiet crackle of dry twigs beneath careful fingers spoke of life clinging on, a fragile defiance in the biting cold. Yet even as the embers' glow warmed your palms, the oppressive silence returned, wrapping tightly like a thick cloak around the village. The cocoon's subtle movements grew, slower and more deliberate. A shudder that rolled softly like distant thunder beneath still water. Every nerve hummed with tension, the space between moments thickening into something unspoken but unmistakable. You retraced your steps toward your room, each footfall a ragged echo on the wooden boards, felt rather than heard. The thin paper screens fluttered faintly in a draught, whispering against the hints of shadow gathering in corners. Inside, the familiar quiet embraced you, but beneath it, an unyielding weight pressed deeper, colder. Your fingers grazed the tatami, rough and thin beneath them, grounding you to the fragile moment before what was to come. Then, barely audible, a slow, irregular thump somewhere beyond the fog. It was faint, yet it shattered the heavy stillness like a stone dropping in a well. Your gaze snapped outward to the shifting mists, where dark shapes moved with sudden purpose, the faintest rustle of silk against leaf disturbing the fragile hush. The metallic scent thickened, now an unmistakable presence weaving through the air, sticky and oppressive. Your heart hammered, a slow, deliberate beat as your eyes caught the unmistakable shimmer of movement crossing the boundary. A slender shadow slipping past frozen trunks and tangled branches. It paused just long enough for you to glimpse the glint of something unnatural, a sudden, sharp edge slicing the cold air. Then, as if swallowed by the darkness itself, it vanished into the deepening veil. You stood motionless, breath caught in the fragile space between fear and the silent invitation that beckoned you beyond safety's edge. The village seemed to hold its breath, the flicker of firelight paling beneath the encroaching gloom. The quiet drumming of wings rose again louder now, an insistent crescendo that filled the sky with muted urgency, pressing down, tightening around. You like a noose woven of cold air and shadow. Your fingers brushed the doorframe, the rough wood smooth against tired skin, and the weight of what waited beyond settled, like the final breath before the plunge into dark waters. The silence fractured, a slow, tense promise etched across the gray dawn that stretched before you. And then, in the frozen hush, the faintest whisper emerged, soft, deliberate, a single wordless sound slipping through the crack beneath the door, as impossible and inevitable as the turning of the world itself. You stepped fully into the cold morning, the door closing behind you with a soft finality that echoed faintly through the mist. The gray fog curled around your ankles, thick and patient, as if reluctant to let you go. Your breath hung in small clouds, fragile little ghosts vanishing before you could grasp them. The earth beneath your feet was damp and yielding, a mix of blackened mud and thawing frost that clung cold and wet to your worn soles. The village lay muted beneath the ghostly shroud, its wooden skeletons dissolving softly at the edges, swallowed by a quiet nothingness that stretched further than your eyes dared roam. Above, the branches shivered, weighed down beneath clusters of pale cocoons, silent burrows for threats unseen. You could almost hear the faint stirrings of movement within, like a trembling beneath silk, a slow, deliberate pulse in the brittle air. As you moved toward the perimeter, each step felt heavier, the cold seeping deeper with every inch. The rough edges of your coat scratched against your skin, a rough caress sharpening your senses. The scent you had feared was stronger here now, a raw, metallic tang that neither faded nor promised mercy. It wrapped around you, thick and insistent, biting into the back of your throat. Ahead, the tangled brambles formed a jagged wall, twisted and gnarled like ancient bones. You hesitated briefly, fingers brushing against the bark, rough and cold, flecked here and there with spots of damp moss slick to the touch. A faint scraping noise whispered nearby, a slow, wet sound like fingers dragging reluctantly across stone. Your head turned sharply, eyes sweeping the gloom just beyond the bramble's edge. There, in the gray half-light, shadows shifted with subtle intent. You caught sight of a slender shape, crouched low and still, limbs drawn close in a careful balance between hiding and watching. The dim outline dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed again by the creeping fog. Your heart thudded unevenly, a slow drum sounding out warnings as old as the earth beneath your feet. You drew a long breath, the cold tasting sharp and bitter on your tongue. The air was thick now, with a winding tension, a string tight and trembling. The world held its breath alongside you, each sound amplified in the vast hush. The crackling of distant firewood reached your ears, a faint testament to life clinging stubbornly in the heart of the village. It pulled you back, a fragile tether to warmth and shared struggle. Turning away from the edge, your boots pressed soft impressions into the damp earth, tracing a slow arc back toward the flickering ember glow. Faces emerged from shadow, pale and skeletal in the firelight. Their sunken eyes glistened with exhaustion and quiet determination, a fragile solidarity born of survival and silent prayers. You dared. A brief glance to meet theirs, and for a moment, the weight on your chest lightened, just enough to breathe more freely. The fragile warmth washed over your cold fingers, and you lifted your hands, pressing them close to the hesitant flames. The orange flicker cast faint halos on weathered skin and drew tired lines around drawn lips. The silence between you was thick, punctuated only by the soft crackle of flames and the faint exhale of shared breath. It was a moment suspended between despair and the fragile flame of hope, small but fierce. Yet even here, beneath the flickering firelight, the quiet menace lingered, a presence coiled in the soft rustle of silk and the unseen shudder of wings. The subtle rhythm of beating feathers grew louder, a muted crescendo that wrapped the village in invisible tension. You felt it crawling beneath your skin, a slow vibration threading through your bones. With a steadying sigh, you pulled away from the fire's warmth, the rough fabric of your coat prickling against your hands, damp with sweat despite the chill. The path back to your room was a ribbon of creaking boards and whispering shadows. The paper screens fluttered faintly where the draft seeped in, a pale dance of ghostly light and dark that teased your edges and drew the night closer. Your steps fell quieter as you neared familiar walls. Each footfall was a measured rhythm, a fragile heartbeat in the dense silence. The scent of dry leaves and burnt wood hung heavy. The metallic tang hovered at the boundary of your senses, relentless. You paused for a breath, the weight of the day settling deep in your limbs. The room greeted you with its usual stillness, though beneath it, the tremor of something else lingered. A shifting, unseen, waiting. You slid the door closed with a slow push, the paper screens sighing softly as they sealed away the dim world beyond. You sank onto the tatami, folding your legs beneath you, your hands resting lightly on the worn mat. The familiar roughness grounded you, a fragile anchor in the rising tide of dread. Outside, the silk cocoons swayed gently once more, their movement hypnotic and slow, like white lanterns flickering with secret light. The wings overhead rose in restless murmur, their silent chorus growing, swelling close. A chill brushed your neck, soft as a breath and twice as cold. You turned slowly, eyes scanning the dim corners where shadow pooled, as if expecting the silhouette from the edge to slip beyond the veil and reveal itself. But only silence answered. And then it came again, the faintest whisper, a sound so delicate it might have been the fold of your own breath. It slipped beneath the door, curling cold and close, like a serpent weaving through cracks. The metallic scent deepened, sharper, richer, alive with ancient bitterness. You sat frozen, the air around you thick with anticipation. The stillness stretched taut, like the fragile thread between waking and dreams. Outside, the soft beat of wings rose to a slow, relentless rhythm, drawing closer, nearer, until it seemed the very walls might hum with the promise of what was to come. And in that charged moment, your eyes caught a movement at the edge of darkness, a thin, shifting shadow, inching closer, crossing the boundary, not with sound, but with the slow certainty of a predator claiming its path. You stepped fully into the cold morning, the door closing behind you with a soft finality that swallowed the last sliver of warmth. The village lay enshrouded in a quiet veil of fog, softened edges of wooden houses blurring gently into the mist. Deliberate negotiation with the cold that seeped relentlessly beneath your worn coat. The metallic scent lingered, sharp yet oddly familiar, weaving through the freeze like a subtle thread, binding the world around you. Above, the suspended cocoons swayed softly in the barely stirring breeze, their white shells catching the fragile light like silent lanterns dangling from gnarled branches. Within each, a restless stir hinted at life and shadow sharing, uneasy space, a whispered warning wrapped in delicate silk. Moving with cautious resolve, you trace the outer edge of the village once more, the brush of rough bark against your hand grounding you in the present. The earth bore faint, shallow tracks, signs of movement that spoke of something neither fully seen nor fully understood. You inhaled slowly, mouth dry, the taste of iron sharp at your tongue's edge. The quiet around you deepened, the tension drawn tight like the last thread of a frayed tether. A gentle crackling sound rose faintly from the village's heart. You turned toward the flickering glow of the communal fire pit, where shadowed faces gathered in a delicate circle of warmth. Their eyes, pale and weary, met yours briefly in unspoken acknowledgement. In that shared glance lay exhaustion, fear, but also a flicker of something more, unspoken resilience, woven from countless fragile days. A silent pact to endure whatever the coming darkness might bring. Slowly your breath eased as you stepped back toward that familiar refuge. The faint orange light was a balm, brief and tender as embers fading into ash. Fingers curled lightly around the rough fabric of your coat, its worn threads a small comfort amid the biting cold. For a moment, the village exhaled alongside you, a collective pause where horrors felt momentarily less suffocating, and hopes, though dim, were still allowed their fragile breath. The frozen fog swirled softly at your feet, diffusing the subtle hum of wings stirring overhead. The faint fluttering grew lighter now, less a chorus of menace and more a delicate rhythm, like the steady heartbeat of a world reluctant to surrender. The silk-shrouded cocoons, once ominous vessels of dread, shimmered in the subdued sunlight, a quiet reminder of rebirth hidden in the layers of endings. You sank gently to the tatami within your room, the familiar roughness, a tether between past and present. The walls, muted in the pale light, seemed to cradle the moment, an embrace of stillness, offered after so many tremulous days. Outside, the village held its breath, cradled in the liminal space between what had been lost and what might yet be found. The metallic bite on the air softened, becoming less a threat and more a memory of survival etched into the atmosphere. You closed your eyes briefly, letting the quiet wash over you like a slow, deep tide, pulling away the sharp edges of anxiety and fear. The distant murmur of whispered wings blended into the steady rhythm of your own breath, a fragile harmony of persistence. In the stillness, a subtle warmth returned, a whisper of early spring held deep beneath the frost. The scent of dry leaves gave way to hints of earth reawakening, and the sharpness that once pricked your senses softened into an echo of endurance. The village, scarred but unbroken, seemed to lean gently into this fragile new balance, as if gathering strength beneath the weight of silence. Outside, the pale fog thinned slowly, spilling back toward the trees and distant hills. The last shimmer of silver silk on the cocoons caught a quiet glow, like specks of dawn gleaming through the gloom. You felt the thread between shadow and light stretch taut, then relax. The waiting darkness had shifted, moved into something less certain, something that might yet be faced and transcended. Your fingers brushed the edge of the wooden doorframe softly, the grain warm beneath your skin, despite the chill lingering in the air. You rose slowly, feeling the gentle ache of tired muscles, the steady pulse of a heart tempered by countless quiet battles. The worn kimono, still heavy with day's chill, settled comfortably around you, a ragged emblem of endurance and frailty intertwined. When you looked outside once more, the village breathed a tentative promise. The brittle snap of frost underfoot had softened into the whisper of thaw. The ghostly silhouettes of cocoon-covered branches no longer swayed with menace, but with a delicate serenity, as if carrying the weight of dark memories while hinting at inevitable renewal. You stepped back from the door, letting it close fully with a measured hush. The paper screens fluttered gently with the soft breath of a passing breeze, like a slow sigh escaping into the quiet. Within the room, the dim light wrapped around you in a gentle embrace, soft shadows pooling like comfort in the corners. With a slow, satisfied breath, you settled onto the tatami once again, folding your legs beneath you. The coolness beneath grounded you, a calm anchor after the tempestuous journey. Your eyes fluttered closed, mind easing into the slow descent of rest. Outside, the wings above finally quieted, their song fading into a gentle hush, as if the world itself exhaled, surrendering to the peace earned through relentless endurance. The village slept beneath its pale sky, wrapped once more in silence, not the suffocating silence of fear, but the soft, deep quiet of healing. And you, nestled in this fragile moment between shadow and light, embraced the calm that followed, the final breath before dreams.